$4.8 million. My sister Victoria lifted the silver key ring from attorney Margaret Hale's desk like she was afraid it might disappear. Beside it sat glossy photographs of a penthouse overlooking the city. Fully paid, Margaret confirmed. The room erupted. Oh my God, Victoria. Your father really took care of you. Victoria covered her mouth, but I saw the smile breaking through. I sat beside my fiancé, Ethan, waiting for Margaret to turn the page. She did. And to my daughter, Claire White, I leave the White family farmhouse and its surrounding original parcel. Silence. Someone behind me whispered, the place with the leaking roof. Victoria's eyes flicked toward me. I waited. There had to be more. Margaret closed the will. Ethan's hand slowly slipped away from mine. 20 minutes later, rain hammered the courthouse steps as Victoria stood beneath the awning surrounded by relatives discussing penthouse renovations. Ethan stared after her. Then he looked at me. You'll never amount to her. I thought I'd misheard him. What? You heard me, Claire. You're ending this because my father left me a farmhouse. His jaw tightened. I can't marry a failure. For months, Ethan had talked about what we would do when I received my half. A larger home, investments, our wedding. Suddenly, all those plans had vanished with one sentence in a will. You weren't planning a life with me, I said quietly. You were planning one with my inheritance. He didn't deny it. Instead, he removed the engagement ring he wore on the chain I'd given him, pressed it into my palm, and walked into the rain. I stood there holding that ring in one hand and the farmhouse keys in the other. Victoria passed me moments later. Claire, she glanced at the keys. I'm sure Dad had his reasons. That almost hurt worse. Because for years, I had been the one who stayed. After Mom died, I helped Dad keep the farm running. I scheduled his appointments, dealt with contractors, sorted bills, and drove out whenever something broke. Victoria had built her own glamorous life in the city. Yet she had received a $4.8 million penthouse. I had received the place with peeling paint and a roof everyone joked about. By evening, I was standing inside it. Water dripped steadily from a broken gutter outside. Dust coated the furniture. The kitchen cabinets were faded, and one corner of the ceiling showed an old brown water stain. I dropped the keys onto the kitchen table. That was when I remembered the sealed envelope Margaret had handed me. My name was written across the front in Dad's handwriting. I opened it. There was no explanation. No apology. Only one sentence. Claire, before you decide what I left you, go where your mother kept the preserves. I read it twice. Mom's preserves. When Victoria and I were children, Mom kept jars of peaches, tomatoes, and strawberry jam downstairs. In the basement. Except the basement entrance had disappeared during renovations years ago. I slowly raised my eyes toward the kitchen floor. Why would Dad's final message send me toward a basement that supposedly no longer existed? I pushed my chair back so quickly it scraped across the kitchen floor. Mom's preserves. I could still picture those summer afternoons, her carrying glass jars downstairs while warning Victoria and me not to touch the strawberry jam before winter. But I couldn't picture the basement entrance anymore. Dad had renovated the kitchen years after Mom died. The old door had vanished behind new cabinets and paneling, and I'd always assumed he'd sealed the basement permanently. I started searching. Behind the pantry shelves, beneath the sink, along the wall beside the refrigerator. Nothing. Then I looked at the enormous freestanding cupboard against the far wall. I grabbed one side and pulled. It barely moved. Come on. I dragged it several inches across the floor. Behind it was unfinished wooden paneling. And near the bottom were scratches. Repeated scratches. As though something had been moved across that spot before. A knock sounded at the front door. I froze. Claire. Victoria. I covered the exposed section with the cupboard as best I could and opened the door. She stepped inside, looking around at the peeling walls. I wanted to make sure you were okay. I'm fine. She hesitated. I really thought Dad would split everything evenly. So did I. Victoria walked toward the kitchen window. You know, keeping this place probably isn't practical. I studied her. What are you suggesting? Sell it. She said it too quickly. Then she added, there's already a developer interested in the land. I could introduce you. My eyes narrowed. Dad died weeks ago. The will was read today. How does a developer already know I own this? Victoria's expression tightened for half a second. They've been interested in this area for a while. How much? Probably enough for you to buy a small apartment somewhere. I stared at her. You came here hours after the will reading to convince me to sell. I came to help you. I'm not selling. Her softness disappeared. Claire stopped being sentimental. It's a collapsing house. After she left, I locked the door. Then I opened the folder containing Dad's property records. Several old purchase offers were marked rejected asterisk. Dad had sold neighboring acreage over the years, but every offer involving this original parcel had been refused. Beside its parcel number, he had written 4 words. Never separate from holding structure. Holding structure. I returned to the cupboard. This time I dragged it completely away. I ran my fingers over the damaged paneling until they touched a slight depression. I pressed. Click. The entire section released. Slowly, I pulled it toward me. Behind the wall was darkness, and narrow, wooden stairs descended beneath the farmhouse. I switched on my phone flashlight. Then I stepped into the basement my family had claimed was sealed decades ago. My foot had barely touched the 3rd basement step when my phone rang. Victoria. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. Claire, we're having dinner tomorrow night. You need to come. Why? Because everyone's worried about you. I looked down into the darkness beneath the farmhouse. I'm not discussing the property. Fine, she said quickly. Then don't. The next evening, I discovered she'd lied. The moment I entered the restaurant, my aunt waved me toward a crowded table. There she is. Victoria told us she's helping you unload the farm. I stopped. Unload it. Victoria reached beside her chair and produced a document. Just hear me out. She slid it across the table. At the top was the name of a development company. Below it, preliminary purchase offer, $650,000. That's serious money, Claire, my uncle said. You could start over. Another relative added. Victoria leaned forward. You wouldn't have to worry about repairs or taxes. I already said I'm not selling. A chair moved behind me. I turned. Ethan. My stomach tightened. What is he doing here? Victoria sighed. I invited him. You're making decisions emotionally because of what happened. Ethan sat down, as though he belonged there. Claire, selling is the smartest thing you can do. You discussed my property with my sister. It's $650,000, he said. Frankly, that's more than the place deserves. I looked around the table. Everyone seemed remarkably invested in getting my signature. Less than 48 hours earlier, they had laughed at the farmhouse. Now they were presenting contracts. I placed both hands on the document. Why is everyone so desperate for me to sell? Nobody answered. I turned to Victoria. How did this developer know about the property before I inherited it? Her gaze dropped. Victoria. They contacted Dad first. The table went silent. So there was already an offer. Yes. How much? It doesn't matter. How much? Victoria swallowed. 12 million. I stared at her. The $650,000 contract suddenly looked very different. You knew someone offered Dad $12 million for this supposedly worthless farm. He rejected it. And you never thought that was important. Claire, nobody offers $12 million for a collapsing farmhouse. I folded the contract once and pushed it across the table. I'm not signing anything until an independent attorney examines every document connected to that property. Ethan shook his head. You're being stubborn. No, for the first time, I'm asking the question all of you apparently hoped I wouldn't. I stood. Behind me, Victoria's chair scraped sharply against the floor. Claire, you have no idea what Dad buried in that place. I stopped walking. I drove straight back to the farmhouse. Victoria's words followed me the entire way. You have no idea what Dad buried in that place. This time, I didn't hesitate at the hidden entrance. I switched on my phone flashlight and descended the wooden stairs. At the bottom, I expected dirt floors, old furniture, maybe boxes Dad had forgotten. Instead, my flashlight swept across rows of metal filing cabinets. Survey maps covered one wall. Shelves held decades of ledgers. Incorporation documents were stacked inside labeled folders. And against the far wall stood a fireproof safe. This wasn't storage, I whispered. Dad had kept records down here. I pulled his handwritten message from my pocket. The wording suddenly made sense. There was a date hidden beneath his instruction, the day I had helped him reopen the farm after Mom died. I entered it into the safe. The lock clicked. Inside was a sealed letter addressed to me, several trust documents, corporate certificates, property maps, and Margaret Hale's contact information. I opened the first folder. White Agricultural Holdings. The name appeared again on another document. Then another. I spread the maps across Dad's desk. Dozens of parcels were connected through different subsidiaries. There were references to solar energy leases, agricultural technology licensing, investment accounts, and commercial land. The farmhouse wasn't standing alone. It was connected to all of it. And suddenly, Dad's handwritten warning made sense. Never separate from holding structure. The developer hadn't offered $12 million because they wanted an old kitchen and a leaking roof. They wanted the parcel attached to something much larger. I grabbed my phone and called Margaret. Claire, I found documents in Dad's basement. What documents? I read the trust identification number aloud. Silence. Margaret. Her voice changed. Claire, listen carefully. Do not sign anything. Do not transfer anything. Do not promise anyone anything. My grip tightened around the phone. What exactly did Dad leave me? We need to meet tomorrow morning. Bring every document you found. Before I could ask another question, headlights swept across the kitchen windows upstairs. I climbed quickly out of the basement and looked through the curtain. Ethan's car. The driver's door opened. Then the passenger door. Victoria stepped out. They walked toward the farmhouse together. A second later. Bang, bang, bang. Claire, Victoria shouted. Ethan struck the door again. We know you're inside. I stood perfectly still as the pounding continued. Claire, open the door. Victoria pounded again. I stood in the kitchen with Dad's documents pressed against my chest. Ethan called through the door. We just want to talk. Hours earlier, he had called me stubborn for refusing $650,000. Victoria had admitted Dad rejected $12 million. Now they had driven together to the farmhouse after dark. No, I said through the locked door. I'm meeting Margaret tomorrow. The pounding stopped. Victoria's voice hardened. Don't do anything stupid. I looked toward the hidden basement entrance. I'm not. For once, I knew that was true. The following morning, I carried everything into Margaret Hale's office. She examined the trust documents, corporate certificates, and property maps before turning her computer toward me. Your father structured this years ago. She pointed to the company name I had seen repeatedly. White Agricultural Holdings. He consolidated his major assets under this company: agricultural land, renewable energy leases, commercial property interests, investment portfolios, and licensing rights from agricultural technology developed with his partners. I stared at her. And the farmhouse. It's the designated anchor property of the White Family Heritage Trust. Margaret placed the trust document directly in front of me. My name appeared beneath one phrase: controlling beneficiary. I stopped breathing for a second. Controlling. Yes. What is all of this worth? Margaret turned to the current independent valuation. Approximately $275 million. I actually laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because my mind couldn't reconcile the number with the leaking gutter I'd watched dripping 2 nights earlier. 275 million. Margaret nodded. Victoria's penthouse belongs to her outright. Your father gave her substantial security, but the penthouse was never the primary inheritance. She handed me Dad's letter. His explanation was simple. He remembered who stayed, who handled repairs without demanding repayment, who learned how the farm worked, who helped employees when money became tight, who sat beside him at appointments and never once asked what she would inherit. He had given Victoria security. He had entrusted me with his legacy. For years, I had interpreted Dad's quietness as disappointment. Sitting in Margaret's office, I finally understood that he had been watching more closely than I ever realized. When the formal estate accounting was distributed, Victoria learned exactly what the farmhouse represented. She stared at the documents across Margaret's conference table. So Claire controls all of that. The trust, Margaret corrected calmly. Yes. Victoria's penthouse keys sat beside her hand. For the first time, she didn't look excited by them. I didn't celebrate. I simply gathered my papers and left. Days later, Ethan appeared at the farmhouse alone. He had changed completely. Claire, I was overwhelmed. I almost smiled. Overwhelmed. Your father had just died. The will reading was emotional. I said things I didn't mean. You said you couldn't marry a failure. I made a mistake. Then came the sentence I knew was coming. We can still have the wedding we planned. I reached into my pocket. The ring he had returned was still there. I placed it in his palm. You already told me what I was worth when you thought I had nothing. Claire. I closed the door. There was nothing left to discuss. I rejected the developer's offer. With independent financial and legal advisors, I reorganized management of the holdings while preserving the original farm. Victoria kept her $4.8 million penthouse, but she received no control over my trust. Our relationship became distant, especially after I accepted that she had known developers were offering millions for the farmhouse while still pressuring me to sell quickly. Ethan never got another chance. Months later, contractors climbed onto the farmhouse roof, not to demolish it but to restore it. The broken gutter disappeared. The peeling walls were repaired. Dad's basement records were cataloged and professionally archived. I kept the hidden entrance. Sometimes I would stand in that restored kitchen and remember the woman who had arrived there carrying a broken engagement and believing she had received the leftovers. That woman had spent her entire life competing with Victoria. I didn't anymore. Victoria had the glamorous penthouse everyone applauded. I had responsibility for the legacy Dad trusted me to protect. And Ethan had given me something unexpectedly valuable, too. He had revealed exactly who he was before I married him. The farmhouse everyone laughed at was worth $275 million. But the most valuable thing I found behind that basement door was proof that I never needed their approval to know what I was worth.